All right, so today we're going to be taking a look at food chains and different types of organisms and how they get energy. So in this case, you're going to see how energy flows from different organisms and what they need from their environment. Now, this is one of the 8 characteristics of living things, that organisms, all living things, need to get and use materials and energy. Now, how do organisms get energy? Well, some organisms, they're called producers or autotrophs. They mean the same thing, where they have to make their own food in their bodies, and they get that energy to make their own food in their bodies by getting it from the sun. So they get energy by once they make that food, they break it down, and they can use that energy for whatever they need to live. Now, that process of making their food in their own bodies using the sun's energy is called photosynthesis. Now, some parts of the world, like deep down in the ocean, the sunlight cannot reach those areas. So organisms that need to make their own food in those areas, they can't use the sun to make their own food. So instead, they'll use other things around them like chemicals, and they will use a process called chemosynthesis instead. But not all organisms make their own food using the sun's energy. Some organisms get energy by eating something else, and those organisms are called consumers, or another word for that is heterotrophs. Now, there are different types of consumers or heterotrophs depending on what they eat. These 3 organisms here, they only eat plants. So the type of consumer they are herbivores. Now, other organisms eat both plants and animals, like these 3 organisms here, okay, and we call them omnivores. Organisms that eat only other animals, okay, they're called carnivores. And organisms that eat things that have recently died, maybe they have died for, let's say, I don't know, like a disease, age, or maybe another organism hunted them and they're getting all the leftovers, they're called scavengers. So they're not necessarily doing the hunting, eating, and killing. They kind of just wait around for the leftovers. And then organisms, once things die and they start to rot and decay, other organisms like these worms, mushrooms, fungi, bacteria, they get energy from those dead and decaying things, and they're called decomposers. Those are the different types of consumers, or we call them heterotrophs, that are available. Okay, so pause and answer these questions in the stop and jot. Humans, are they considered producers? We also call them autotrophs, or consumers. We also call them heterotrophs. Well, humans, we don't make our food in our bodies. We eat other organisms, so we're consumers. And what type of consumer are humans typically? Humans typically are omnivores because humans normally eat plants and animals. Now, we can show what organisms eat by making a food chain or a food web. If you see, here's a food chain, and here are arrows pointing to different organisms. Now, on the left of the arrow, that's the food. And on the right of the arrow, that's the eater. That's the thing that's eating. But I want us to take it a step further and show that the arrow points to where the energy is going to next. So the algae has all this energy, and it gives it to the striped fish when it's being eaten by the fish. That's why the arrow is going towards the striped fish. Now the striped fish now has all this energy, and if you see, the arrow is pointing to the spotted fish because the energy goes to the spotted fish. So make sure you keep in mind that the arrow points to where the energy is going to next. So let's take a look at this stop and jot, pause, and label underneath each organism. What is each organism based off of just this information in the food chain? Is it a producer, an herbivore, an omnivore, or a carnivore? Well, in the beginning of every type of food chain, you always start with a producer, organisms that make their own food. Now, its energy is going to the striped fish, and that striped fish is eating this plant, okay, or a producer. So that's an herbivore. And the spotted fish is eating the striped fish, which is another organism, another animal. So that's a carnivore. Now, each one of these organisms, scientists put them into different levels. We call them trophic levels. Okay, and we always start with the beginning of the food chain, that's our first trophic level, and we move up to the end of the food chain. Okay, now each one of these trophic levels has a specific name. So whoever is in the beginning is a producer. So the specific name for that trophic level is it's a primary producer, because primary is the first one in the food chain, and it's a producer. It makes its own food. The second organism in the food chain is eating something else. It doesn't make its own food, it's eating something else, so it's a consumer. And even though it's the second thing in line in the food chain, it's the primary consumer. It's the first thing in the food chain that starts to eat something else. The third organism in the food chain, okay, also eats something else. That's why it's a consumer, okay? But it's now the second thing that eats another organism. And then the fourth trophic level, they're also consumers, but they're the third thing in line in the food chain that eat. That's why we call them a tertiary consumer. And I know I don't have this on your notes, fifth trophic level, so please type it out. In the fifth trophic level, that means the fifth organism in line is also a consumer, but they're the fourth thing to start eating. That's why we call them quaternary consumers. So go ahead and, using these purple terms, go ahead and label each organism's trophic level name: algae, striped fish, and spotted fish, using these purple terms. So the algae is the first in line. It's a producer, so we're going to name it a primary producer. The striped fish is the first thing that eats in the food chain. Okay, so it's a consumer, but it's the first thing that eats, so it's a primary consumer. And the spotted fish is the second thing that eats, okay, something else, so it's a secondary consumer.